In October 1347, 12 merchant ships dropped anchor off Sicily in southern Italy. No traders stepped ashore, no cargo was unloaded. Only corpses lay scattered on deck, and a few souls gasped their final breaths. In the years that followed, the plague those ships carried would kill hundreds of millions. Fear crept into every corner of the continent, except one small village that would succeed in holding back the worst pandemic in history. But how? Back in the 6th century, within the Roman Empire, a strange illness appeared. It brought high fevers, exhaustion, and large swollen lumps across the body. It swept through populations and stole tens of millions of lives, then burned out simply because it had no one left to kill. Humanity had just met the horror of bubonic plague. Centuries after that first outbreak, the pathogen never vanished. It lurked among rodent populations in parts of Asia, waiting for its chance. In the early 13th century, as maritime trade routes exploded, the plague hitched rides on ships and spread around the world. By the 1340s, it poured into Europe from the Black Sea, carried by a dozen ships that put in at Sicily, ushering in a dark era history would later call the Black Death. Around 200 million people, nearly half of the world's population at the time, perished. For centuries, the cause of plague remained a mystery. Many Europeans believed it was divine punishment for human sin. They sought forgiveness through prayer or by whipping themselves, begging the Almighty for mercy. Others blamed a poisonous miasma, a foul air they thought drifted through cities. The wealthy carried sachets stuffed with fragrant herbs and spices to mask the so-called bad air, while the poor covered their mouths with scraps of cloth, anything to ward off the invisible. Doctors donned eerie protective outfits, cloaks from head to toe and a long beaked mask. Inside the beak, they packed more than 50 herbs and ingredients like honey or even powdered viper. The outfit was attributed to Charles de Lorme, a 17th century royal physician, who believed the long beak would filter the air through pleasant aromatics. None of it worked. The disease kept spreading. Not until the late 19th century did Dr. Alexandre Yersin identify the culprit, a deadly rod-shaped bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis. It sabotages our defenses by injecting toxins into immune cells like macrophages. Once those bodyguards are neutralized, the bacteria multiply fast. People first blamed rats for spreading plague. Today we know the real vector was the rat flea, Xenopsylla cheopis. When a rat died, its fleas leapt to a new host, carrying infection with them, often straight into human communities. Plague could also spread through handling corpses, contact with infected blood, or inhaling droplets in the air. After infection, painful red swellings, usually in the armpit or groin, appeared quickly. Blood and pus could ooze from these buboes, while victims suffered high fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and body-wide pain. Without effective treatment, death often came within 4 to 6 days. For 4 centuries, the Black Death haunted Europe. Yet there was one place the reaper's scythe couldn't fully reach. In 1665, about 300 years after the first Great Wave, England faced a massive new outbreak centred in London. In a single summer, around 15% of London's people died. At night, the cry, "Bring out your dead," echoed through the streets. Bodies piled onto carts and into mass graves. As the crisis worsened, King Charles II fled to Oxford. Anyone who could escape the city. The poor were left to wait for death. Parliamentary aid was slow and indifferent. As death spiraled, authorities locked infected households inside for 40 days. A red cross and the plea, "Lord, have mercy upon us," were painted on their doors. Guards enforced the quarantine, nurses delivered food. But in cramped, filthy rooms, a 17th century quarantine often felt like a collective death sentence. After 40 days, few survived. The rich fled, and trade routes carried plague into the countryside. That's how disaster arrived at Eyam, a small village in Derbyshire, in an unexpected way. In late August 1665, a bundle of cloth from London reached the local tailor's house. An apprentice named George Vickers opened the package. The cloth was damp and crawling with fleas, so he hung it by the fire to dry. The heat drove the fleas out, onto George. By nightfall, red spots spread across his body. His lymph nodes swelled and filled with pus. He burned with fever and raved in delirium. 3 days later, he was dead. Within a month, 5 more villagers died with the same signs. Some families were wiped out completely that autumn. Winter cold briefly slowed the deaths, but the next hot summer awakened the fleas, and the plague roared back. There were no doctors or nurses in Eyam. The villagers turned to their vicar, William Mompesson. In 17th century England, the church carried immense authority, and local clergy were the backbone of their communities. Mompesson had arrived only 2 years earlier to replace the previous minister, Thomas Stanley, a beloved figure who'd been removed for opposing the 1662 Act of Uniformity and its mandatory prayer book. Many locals resented Mompesson. Still, crisis forced them to listen, even as he admitted he didn't yet know how to stop the disease. Mompesson sought out Stanley. Together they devised a radical plan to save others. Eyam would cut itself off from the world. On June 24th, 1666, as the church bell tolled another funeral, the 2 ministers announced the unthinkable: full village quarantine. No one welcomed the idea. If plague didn't kill them, starvation might. Then a lifeline appeared. The Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth House, only a few miles away, agreed to supply food throughout the quarantine. Goods would be left at a boundary landmark, near a lonely spring and a boundary stone. Villagers would leave payment, coins soaked in vinegar for disinfection, and pick up their rations. With food secured, faith steadied their resolve. They believed only a voluntary lockdown could prevent the disease from spilling into neighboring towns. If they died, they would meet God without the guilt of spreading calamity. The rules were strict. Each household was responsible for its own hygiene and isolation. Neighbors avoided contact. The dead were not carried through the village to the churchyard. Instead, families buried loved ones in their gardens or nearby fields. Sunday services moved outdoors to a nearby valley called Cucklet Delph, where families stood apart in silence as prayers were said. For the first 2 months, the quarantine seemed hopeless. In July, 56 people died. In August, 78. Some panicked and tried to flee. Others stayed, clinging to their promise to protect the outside world. Faith alone, however, did not decide who lived and who died. One story tells of Emmet Siddle, a 20-year-old from Eyam, and her fiancé, Roland Torre, from the neighboring village of Stony Middleton. Emmet lived across from the tailor's house where George Vickers had died. Soon after, plague claimed her family. At first, Roland risked everything to visit her, but Emmet refused to meet in person. To be safe, they went to the ravine near the outdoor services. There, they would sit at a distance and simply look at one another. No touch, no words. Then one day Emmet did not come. Only after the plague ended did Roland learn she had died. Amid the grief, a few stories seemed miraculous. Some people never fell ill even as everyone in their households perished. Elizabeth Hancock was one. Her family lived on the village edge and avoided the disease at first. But in August 1666, the youngest son developed dark, swollen buboes. 2 days later, her daughter was sick. In less than a week, 6 children and Elizabeth's husband were dead. Because bodies weren't allowed to be moved, she buried each of them herself on their land, graves now known as the Riley graves. Despite constant exposure to the sick and the dead, Elizabeth never became ill. Marshal Howe's case was just as strange. He caught the plague early but recovered. After that, he dug graves for families who had no one left to help. When someone was dying alone, he would enter the house, take a few valuables as payment, and carry the body to the churchyard. He handled hundreds of corpses without any protection, and somehow the disease never returned. Perhaps his immunity came at a terrible cost. Plague had already taken his wife and 2-year-old son. Even Mompesson faltered. On August 22nd, 1666, with the village at its breaking point, he walked the hills with his wife. The next morning, she was dead. The blow nearly broke him. Then, strangely, the disease began to slow. Through the autumn of 1666, deaths rose more slowly. On November 1st, the last entry was made in Eyam's burial register. Winter arrived, and the plague was gone. What ended the nightmare? Tales of miraculous survival spread across England, alongside eerie rumors of the dead rising. Which were true? Which were legend? And how many had Eyam actually saved? A 2016 epidemiological study, drawing on parish registers kept by Stanley and Mompesson and tax records from 1664, estimated Eyam's population at about 689. Of these, 257 died and 432 survived. Incredibly, after living with plague for more than a year, about 63% of Eyam's people were still alive. Death rates and assumed rural space protected the countryside, but historian Justin Champion analysed London's plague records using modern methods, linking tax data to living standards and comparing them with burial registers. Surprisingly, poverty, poor hygiene and crowding didn't neatly predict who died. In the face of plague, rich and poor suffered alike. Eyam's isolation and open space alone couldn't fully explain its survival rate either. So why did some fall ill while others didn't? Large-scale studies of infectious disease show outcomes vary widely between individuals. Not everyone gets infected. Not everyone dies when they do. We often credit diet, environment, or general health, but science points to something deeper: our genes. Common wisdom blamed urban filth and crowding for high death rates, and assumed rural space protected the geneticist. Stephen O'Brien proposed a bold idea. Eyam's survivors might have been protected by inherited mutations. If so, those genes would persist across generations. Researchers collected DNA from the descendants of Eyam's families. While waiting for results, O'Brien focused on a variant called SER5-delta32, delta 32, a mutation known to affect immune responses. If it didn't appear in Eyam, the hypothesis would falter. If it did, medicine might gain a powerful clue. Pathogens need doorways to enter human cells. Yersinia pestis exploits immune cells themselves, hijacking white blood cells and riding them to lymph nodes, where it spills out and attacks the command center of our defenses. That takeover makes plague so deadly. The hypothesis, CCR5-delta32, might lock one of those cellular doors, slowing or blocking invasion. After 3 weeks of testing at University College London, results came back. Delta 32 appeared in about 14% of samples. But did that mean anything? Scientists mapped the mutation's global distribution. It was virtually absent in Africa, South America, and East Asia. The frequency found in Eyam matched regions of Europe once devastated by plague, and in the Americas, where many people descend from European survivors. Delta 32 is, at heart, a genetic mistake. Such mutations usually fade unless they grant a powerful survival advantage. But if Delta 32 helps against plague, why did some people still get sick and live? O'Brien offered a simple answer. Someone like Elizabeth Hancock may have carried 2 copies of the mutation, from both parents, which can provide strong protection. Others with only 1 copy weren't fully shielded. They could fall ill, but the infection spread more slowly, giving the immune system time to fight back. Some of those people, like Marshall Howe, survived. The discovery of Delta 32 didn't just illuminate Eyam's survival, it opened doors for modern medicine, especially against HIV. In 1996, researchers showed that CCR5-Delta 32 can lock the very doorway many HIV strains use to enter immune cells. Drug makers raced to mimic this natural defense. Today, a few patients have been cured of HIV after receiving stem cell transplants from donors with the CCR5-Delta 32 mutation. These cases are rare, but they prove a point and kindle hope. Humanity may yet defeat the disease of the century. Today, Eyam is a quiet village in the English countryside. Even in the new century, its population sits under 1,000, only slightly larger than before the plague. You'll find cozy pubs, warm cafes, a centuries-old church, and green plaques on cottage walls. Each plaque bears the names of families who lost loved ones in 1665 to 1666. They stand as a lasting reminder that our lives today may have been bought with the courage of those who chose to lock their village and save everyone beyond it.